From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the Biz Talk Radio Network and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. One of the most influential Fed chairmen in history, the man behind irrational exuberance, a brilliant look into the opaque Alan Greenspan with the author of an epic biography of Greenspan, just selected as the Financial Times and McKinsey Business Book of the Year. That's all today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Sebastian Mallaby, author of several books, including the best-selling More Money Than God, Hedge Funds, and the Making of the New Elite, and we're taping in the hedge fund capital, Greenwich. Sebastian, former Financial Times contributing editor, two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist. He's the Paul Volcker Senior Fellow for International Economics at the Council on Foreign Relations, and that prize-winning book, The Man Who Knew the Life and Times of Alan Greenspan. Welcome from London, Sebastian.
Very good to be with you, Jim.
And congratulations, of course, on winning the Best Business Book of the Year award. Now, you're the Paul Volcker Senior Fellow, so let me just put you on the spot initially and compare and contrast Volcker and Greenspan.
Well, I guess the conventional wisdom would be that Volcker was the hero because he's the one who brought down inflation from that very high double-digit level in the late 1970s. So Volcker is remembered, he was 6'7" tall. He was the rumpled Old Testament prophet, a kind of Churchillian hero fighting the big battle against inflation. Greenspan, by contrast, took over the Fed in 1987, and he took it over when Volcker had already gotten rid of most of the inflation. But Greenspan finished the job and presided for a very long time, 18 and a half years, over a kind of peacetime Fed, if you like. So, I would compare Volcker to a wartime president and Greenspan to a peacetime president.
Interesting. Now, the man who knew, it gives off kind of a conspiratorial sense. Is this sort of the insight of the book, that this Mr. Irrational Exuberance but didn't take the actions needed before the big crash?
Yes, the title, The Man Who Knew, has a couple of different meanings. One is that he rose to power because he always knew the answer to the boss's question. So if the president wanted to know, exactly what would happen to the economy if he cut taxes this much, Greenspan was the guy who had the answer. But Greenspan, more interestingly and tantalizingly, was the man who knew that finance is fundamentally unstable. People don't realize this, or didn't realize this until I did the research, but Greenspan's early life was focused on the study of bubbles, irrational market prices, market overshoots, and the sense that the central bank's main duty was to stabilize the economy in the face of those asset price swings, which is just, so ironic because it was asset price bubbles that laid him low when he was Fed chairman.
Now, he is sort of Mr. Empirical Data meets politics. He was a rational thinker. And I've interviewed Fred Sheehan and David Stockman, who are both highly big critics of Greenspan, who basically say he pandered to power, he sold out to politics, he would do things like support George W. Bush's tax cuts without the other side of the equation, cost cuts, etc. Where do you come down on that?
Well, Greenspan was an intensely political figure. There's no doubt about that. And in fact, if there ever had been some doubt, my book completely removes it. I mean, it shows how Greenspan came into the public square as an advisor to Richard Nixon in the 1967-68 campaign, and it was known that he'd given economic advice. But what I show is that he was the polling analyst, the message advisor, the spin doctor as well. And through the 70s, he got involved in all kinds of dirty tricks. I don't want to ruin the whole story here, but, some of the guys who went to jail for Watergate were involved in various tricks that Greenspan got implicated in. So he was an intensely political figure. And I think it's true that at the end of the day, he wanted to accumulate political influence, accumulate power, but not risk his political capital by making himself unpopular by raising interest rates to fight bubbles.
Kind of a different than Volcker, who seemed to be happy to take on the power elite. Now we got this genius failure sort of dichotomy. You got to give him an A for the management of inflation over 18 and a half years, I would guess. Does he get an F on regulation? On regulatory oversight? How do you put those two together?
That's very interesting. He gets an A in terms of price stability, but he gets a bad grade, I don't know, an F, but, something less good, let's say a C, on financial stability. And the interesting thing is, did he mess up on financial stability because he got interest rates wrong or regulation wrong? The standard line would be to say, interest rates are really about stabilizing inflation, so if there was a financial crisis, that's a regulatory failure, not an interest rate mistake. I have a different view in my book because I show that the Fed did try to use regulation to stabilize finance much more than people realize. So through Freedom of Information Act requests, I could divulge what was going on inside the Fed about subprime mortgages, for example. And what that shows you is they tried regulation, but regulation is very difficult to make stick in Washington because it's so balkanized amongst different oversight agencies, the FTC, SEC, Controller of the Currency, the Congress gets involved, the state insurance regulators. So in my view, although the conventional line on Greenspan is that he didn't regulate enough, I think the real truth is that nobody can regulate financial bubbles, and therefore you have to be willing to respond to them using interest rates sometimes.
And I think one of your tenets is he didn't necessarily respond to the degree he should have. Is one of the ironies and insights from your book that the better he was on price stability, the bigger risk he set on financial stability because of the low interest rates, et cetera, and everything overbooming?
Yeah, that's absolutely at the core of it. If you look at the charts, I have just a few very simple charts in the back of my book, and a couple of them are there to show you that inflation came down lower than it had been under Paul Volcker and was also less variable than under Paul Volcker. And so that job of stabilizing prices was completed, and as a result, economic growth was very smooth outside of the crises. So that was the big achievement, the great moderation, it was called. But because the macroeconomy seems so moderate and so stable, traders in Wall Street, who have basically a fixed appetite for risk, say to themselves, gee, there's less risk than we thought from inflation and from macro growth. That's all pretty stable. So we can afford to take extra risk by borrowing more, by leveraging up our bets. And when you look at a graph of debts in the economy or the shadow banking system in the economy, any of those measures of financial indebtedness look like, a sort of crazy upward slide through the Greenspan years as more and more debt gets piled on.
Now, let me ask you this as we finish out this segment in a couple of minutes. First, I thought it was impressive that he opened everything to you, particularly after the sort of the bad news that ended after his 18 years. How does he see himself at this stage? Reputation irreparably damaged? What does the maestro think of where he ends up?
As I was saying, he accumulated more and more political capital through his long life. He became Fed chairman when he was 61. He left when he was 80. He was already a famous person before he became Fed chairman because he'd been, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Ford White House in the 70s and, on the board of J.P. Morgan. So his long life really can be explained in terms of this absolutely strong appetite to accumulate more and more influence and more reputation. And he did it better than anybody else. He is the preeminent financial statesman of the post-war era, and just in terms of the length of time he spent at the top and his presence in the American mind when he was Fed chairman. So to lose that in the 2008 crisis, to see, the markets crash, to see his reputation go from maestro to villain, from hero to zero, that's incredibly painful.
Was he disappointed that he never got to be Treasury Secretary?
He did want to be Treasury Secretary early on, in the 70s. I think if the election in 1976 had gone the other way and Ford had beaten Jimmy Carter, Ford would have picked Greenspan as his Treasury Secretary. But it turned out, and this is sort of one of the ironies of history, that, it was way better to be Fed chairman than to be Treasury Secretary, because Treasury Secretaries, tend to last 4 years, maybe occasionally a bit longer, but that's about the max. Greenspan was able to stick in his chair as Fed chairman for 18 and a half years and really define the era.
As we go out of this segment, I'll take one of the statements you found he made as a youth. The creation of the Fed was one of the disasters in American history. Business Talk with Jim Campbell over the Biz Talk Radio Network, 350 stations around the country. You can go to biztalkradio.com, find the station nearest to you, listen over the Internet, and access our podcasts. We'll talk Greenspan's roots coming up next with Sebastian Mallaby. We're back with Sebastian Mallaby from London. He's on the Council of Foreign Relations. We're talking about Alan Greenspan. I want to go back initially and get your sense of the impact on his life, how it helped form him. Product of a single mom, essentially, lacking a father figure, almost a negative view of that. Music prodigy and a math prodigy, which is an interesting combination. Talk about his roots.
Well, he grew up on the northern tip of Manhattan in Washington Heights. And as you say, his parents got divorced when Alan was only 3. And so essentially his father disappeared, and he was left without a father figure. But his mother was extremely devoted. She never remarried. She never had other children. So Alan was the central figure in her life, the only outlet for all her love and her emotion. And so what that did was that on the one hand, Greenspan felt this very powerful sense of somebody who really believed in him deeply. But at the same time, because his mother was a vivacious figure and, at family gatherings she would lean over the piano and sing haunting songs in the manner of a torch singer, Greenspan felt he couldn't compete with that level of attractiveness. And he always called himself a sideman because he was off to the side of the party, less sort of naturally charming than his mother was. And I think what that did was that, on the one hand, he knew he was great because his mother believed in him so much. On the other hand, he couldn't get recognition from just going into a room and being charming to everybody because he just wasn't that kind of person. He was too shy. So in order to achieve the recognition that motherly devotion persuaded him that he deserved, he had to go out and work for it. He had to get objective achievements. For example, getting very rich, very young, dating very glamorous women, and then achieving enormous political power. All of that to get these external markers of success so that those could line up with that internal belief in himself which came from his mum.
Interesting. Now, how does he track from this devotee of Ayn Rand, which is really out on the libertarian fringes, to becoming such a pragmatist that he didn't even really buy into the whole Reagan supply-side revolution?
I mean, that is a fascinating transition, and it's one of the reasons why, this project took me longer than any other book I've written. I've done 4 books, and my kids tease me because each one takes longer than the last one. But this one was more than 5 years because of what I discovered. And what I discovered was that he went, as you just said at the end of the previous segment, from somebody who said that the creation of the Federal Reserve was an historic disaster. I mean, you can't make that irony up. The man who embodied the Fed later on, personified the central bank, said that there shouldn't be a central bank, when he was younger. And it wasn't when he was a kid. I mean, he made that statement in his late 30s. So how did he do that transition from believing there shouldn't be a central bank, there should just be a gold standard, to then becoming the guy who prints all the money? And I think what happens is that, when he meets Richard Nixon, he starts off as the libertarian believer in gold as a form of money, but quickly realizes if he gives that kind of advice, Nixon will simply ignore him. And if he wants to really be influential, be a player, then he needs to moderate his views and kind of operate within the system as he finds it. And that's, I think, in a nutshell, it was the desire to be influential, relevant, and at the center of power, not to be a sideman, that drove him to moderate his libertarianism.
Now, he seems to, his insights, his data insights, he comes up with some of the things that set him apart. One that I thought was really interesting was figuring out sort of off GDP metrics like the growth in home equity that sort of went on underneath the hood, and coming up with that, and then uncovering that by the time we get to the crash, that so many people were taking out 100% essentially of the net equity in their house, which obviously is a formula for disaster.
One of the funny things about Greenspan as an economist was that, he left college, he did a bit of graduate school in around 1950. And at that time, most economists were totally uninterested in the bond market or in finance because basically it had gone to sleep. The market had crashed in 1929, and Wall Street and finance didn't play really a major role in the economy until the 60s. But in this period, Greenspan fortuitously got a job working for somebody as a consultant who had been a bond market expert back in the 20s. And so he always was more interested in finance and also in financial instability than most economists of his generation, much more attuned to the way that something like rising house prices could lead people to borrow against those rising house prices, and that borrowing would translate into spending power and could turn out to be the main driver of economic growth for a while. So that interaction between bubbly finance and real economic performance was central to his preoccupations from early on.
Look at some of the historic episodes that he went through. Richard Nixon putting in wage and price controls and ending Bretton Woods, and he was whispering in Nixon's ears. What did he think of those kinds of moves?
So on the one hand, Nixon imposed price controls on the economy, and Greenspan was a very principled and early critic of that. Even though he had worked for Nixon in the election campaign, he criticized Nixon publicly for trying to believing that you could possibly, regulate the difference between the price increases in, coffee beans and coffee powder or oranges and orange juice. It was just micromanagement of the economy taken to a crazy extent. And Greenspan was right about that. And he was correct that that kind of policy merely bottled up inflation temporarily, but then it burst out into the open later in the 1970s. So he was courageous and correct on the price control question. Where he was a bit less principled is where Nixon wanted to force the Fed, with its chairman Arthur Burns, to cut interest rates ahead of the 1972 election so that Nixon would have an easier time getting reelected. And there was this dirty trick that the Nixon henchmen cooked up where they smeared the Fed chairman in public in order to embarrass him. And when he was super embarrassed and ready to do anything to recover his public reputation, they sent in Greenspan to say, look, this is Washington, this is politics. If you don't want them to beat you up, maybe you should consider a different policy.
Yeah, that's sort of, I found upsetting that Nixon playing around with the economy. We're down to the last minute. He chaired a fixing Social Security task force, and I wanted to know what you thought of that, and did he not end up going far enough tackling entitlements?
Well, it was interesting that he was a libertarian, and this was a period when already people were recommending private Social Security accounts. And whatever you think about the merits of that proposal, it's fascinating that Greenspan absolutely didn't go there. He only just, tweaked the revenues and tweaked the expenditures so that the books would add up without fundamentally changing the design of the Social Security system. So that showed Greenspan being highly pragmatic, not being ideological. And I think it's an interesting warning for people who say, gee, we had a crisis in 2008 because Greenspan was this laissez-faire ideologue who believed in the, self-policing efficiency of markets. That just isn't true. And one of the measures of Greenspan's pragmatism is how, when it came to fixing Social Security, he did such a nip-and-tuck kind of fix.
Interesting. Business Talk with Jim Campbell. We'll talk about the central banker when we get back. We're back with Sebastian Mallaby. He's the author of a new book just out, the Best Business Book of the Year award winner, by the way, The Man Who Knew the Life and Times of Alan Greenspan, as we continue looking at some of the major events. Long-term capital management, which was located right here in Greenwich, leveraged over 100 to 1 and showed the interdependencies of all these financial institutions that could go down at once. How did that impact him?
Well, when long-term capital management blew up in the fall of 1998, the Fed convened the bankers' committee that recapitalized long-term capital management to prevent it from simply dumping all its positions, which would have caused havoc in the markets. But what Greenspan really did beyond that is that he responded to the shock by cutting interest rates no fewer than 3 times in a short period, just as he said, to put insurance into the market so that at a moment when there could be kind of unpredictable knock-on effects from long-term capital being destabilized, he just didn't want it to take any risks. So if you could contrast that to the moment when Lehman Brothers was allowed to go bankrupt exactly 10 years later, Greenspan wasn't going to take that kind of risk.
That leads me to the famous Greenspan put. Did that end up being sort of a moral hazard?
Yes, I think it did. I mean, I think that in a general sense, traders would, kid each other. Uncle Alan will take care of us. In other words, if the markets really go wrong, don't worry because the Fed has got our backs. They'll cut interest rates and protect us. So I think it did that, and it was particularly unfortunate because what happened was those 3 interest rate cuts after long-term capital management went down came exactly as the NASDAQ stock market bubble was beginning to get serious. And so those cuts were left in place early into 1999 when you started to get these initial public offerings of companies like Priceline.com, which had pretty much 0 assets, 0 revenues, and still were being floated at enormous valuations. And I think the froth in the equity market would have been way less bad if that interest rate cut, to cushion the LTCM thing, if that had been taken back faster, the economy would have been in a healthier shape.
Interesting. All right, let's review going into the big, what led up to the big crash, the financial weapons of mass destruction, if you will, as Berkshire Hathaway's Buffett calls them, credit default swaps, derivatives, basically. How much responsibility do you have attached to him for not taking this on? Brooksley Bourne, who was chaired the CFTC, obviously was trying to push for a clearing exchange to get him onto the books, so to speak. Glass-Steagall allowing that to be repealed. How much culpability?
There's got to be some. You can't be the most influential economist in the world and then say, gee, it wasn't my fault when the system blows up in 2008. And I do think that derivatives are better when they are forced onto exchanges and into clearinghouses, that the over-the-counter trading is a kind of disaster waiting to happen. So I do fault Greenspan for not pushing more aggressively to get those onto exchanges. Now, in his defense, I think it's important to remember that he wasn't the only guy who opposed regulating derivatives.
Right.
For example, Bob Rubin, the Treasury Secretary at the time, agreed with him, even though Rubin himself was actually quite skeptical of financial innovation. I mean, he used to be teased by Larry Summers, the Deputy Treasury Secretary, and by Greenspan, and they would say, if you were playing tennis, you'd want a wooden tennis racket because you're so anti-innovation. And so Bob Rubin was open to the idea of regulating derivatives, but when Brooksley Bourne proposed it, he didn't go with it because he just thought that the lobbies would block everything in the Congress. It would be impossible to get a good law through, and he wasn't willing to invest the political energy it would have taken to try to fight for derivatives regulation. And I think, that was not a crazy judgment. I mean, I think it's true that the lobbies would have blocked stuff in Congress. When the repeal of Glass-Steagall was finally ratified in 1999, the law that did that had been introduced into the Congress 14 times. So, I mean, it was incredibly difficult to get reform passed. And I think that's why, in understanding what went wrong before 2008, you have to give a big role to the political constraints in Washington, D.C.
And that's a good point that I got out of your book, too, that Brooksley Born, in retrospect, is treated as his hero. But you make it clear in the book that, unlike Alan's talents, she wasn't very good on the politics. She pissed off all the guys, basically.
Yeah, and by the way, not just the guys. I mean, she pissed off also the women, and that's important because there was a sort of narrative about that incident where, the female regulator tries to get something done, and then all the guys gang up on her. But I interviewed one of the governors of the Fed, a woman who had previously headed the CFTC, Susan Phillips, and frankly, she was as anti-Brooksley Born as anything else, just because Brooksley Born's manner was that of a combative litigator and not an alliance builder.
Interesting how those things and personalities end up impacting the world so much. And talking about the world, was the Committee to Save the World, Reuben Summers and Alan Greenspan, was that real? I mean, were they that linked up? Did they view themselves as doing that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the close alliance between Bob Rubin and Larry Summers at the Treasury, and then with Greenspan and it was very close. I mean, they liked each other. They, agreed. They often generated new ideas by kicking ideas back and forth together over breakfast. So that was a very close-knit trio. And the Committee to Save the World was the cover of Time magazine with these three economists on the front. Interestingly, Greenspan was in the middle of that picture and occupied about 70% of the space because of his stature at the time, and he really was the maestro. But the thing that they stabilized and that Time magazine was focused on was sort of the, East Asia crises, long-term capital management. It was the global financial situation that they were seen to be lifting up on their shoulders.
By the way, you sort of say that making him, naming him the maestro was sort of an incautious, meaning overused thing, and that's a shot to me. I was guessing at Bob Woodward for basically sort of doing more of a lapdog report. Am I right on that?
Well, Bob Woodward deserves enormous respect as the guy who was...
Well, he wrote the book. He wrote the book,
Nixon, right?
Yeah, he wrote the book called Maestro, right, I think?
Yeah, but it is interesting that, the author of the book called Maestro, Bob Woodward, had on the one hand been the toughest journalist in Washington, D.C. during Watergate, and on the other hand gave Greenspan this sort of almost hagiographic treatment in his book on Greenspan. I think what that tells you partly is that Greenspan was a magician when it came to talking to journalists. I mean, he absolutely knew how to push their buttons, how to charm them, how to make them feel smarter than they felt before they talked to him. And so very few journalists were willing to criticize Greenspan because he was so persuasive.
All right, I want to talk about working with some presidents now. First off, did he think he cost George H.W. Bush the election as Bush thought?
Oh, I think he resisted that conclusion. But in my reconstruction of the period of George H.W. Bush, it's clear that Greenspan was surprised that the economy was that weak in late 1991 and early 1992. He didn't plan that. And so what happened, there was a recovery from the recession of 1990. It was just a jobless recovery. And Greenspan admitted at one point that the economy was flying into 50-mile-an-hour headwinds. Ironically, the headwinds were that there was loads of bad real estate debt on the books of the banks, and that was stopping them from making new loans, and that was a drag on the economy. So it was one of those premonitions of 2008 where real estate prices interact with finance, and that interacts with the real economy.
Now, to me, his peak of power with the president, almost William Jefferson Clinton, that actually he blessed the deficit reduction and that spurred the bond market and everything, and that, as Dick Morris said, we needed to figure out what Greenspan had wanted and give it to him. Yeah,
I mean, that's when you get into the period where Greenspan's influence becomes extraordinary. I mean, in the budget arguments between the Clinton administration and the Congress, when they couldn't agree on how much to reduce the deficit by, they basically turned to Alan Greenspan and said, can you tell us? And it started to be the case that Congress would ask Greenspan to testify on almost any subject under the sun, so much so that Greenspan was once joking with his colleagues at the Fed and said, if they invented a new game, and the game was called Zip Switch, and, they would say that I had to be the umpire. And I would say, I don't know what Zip Switch is. I don't know the rules. And they would say, no problem. You know everything. Come and be the umpire anyway. And so it was that was kind of, it was a maestro phenomenon. Whatever you think of Bob Wood's book, the truth is he was regarded in such high esteem that maestro in that sense is an appropriate description.
You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell from our flagship stations, Yale Radio, WYBC, and 1490 WGCH AM Greenwich. The Greenspan legacy in our final national segment. We're back in our final segment with Sebastian Mallaby on the maestro Alan Greenspan. He ends up, with the Clinton era saying best economy I've ever seen, and then after the crash, I've found a flaw. Both of those seem very naive for this guy. How do you assess his legacy?
I think Greenspan deserves enormous credit for a couple of things. One is that modern Fed independence was basically created by Greenspan, in the sense that when he became Fed chairman in 1987, it was perfectly normal for the president to beat up the central bank. Paul Volcker, despite his stature, was surrounded by Reagan appointees who voted against him and outvoted him on some things. And then when Greenspan came into office, it was typical, that continued. And so, for example, in the George H.W. Bush years, the budget director, Richard Darman, would go around Washington whispering, Alan Greenspan is 65 years old. He lives by himself. He calls his mum every day. Isn't that creepy? Doesn't it remind you of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho? So, there was that denigration of Greenspan behind the scenes in order to force him to cut interest rates. And Greenspan just ignored the pressure, stood up to the pressure, and furthermore proved himself able of extracting a price from the Bush administration by going to Congress, getting legislation blocked that they wanted. And so after that, nobody messed with the central bank anymore. And I think that's, by the way, now coming under threat with the president-elect.
Yeah, that was going to be my question. Yeah, with this populist revolution that's going on here, do you see that as a big threat?
I do see it as a threat, and I would say that the answer to the threat is to study what Alan Greenspan did to George H.W. Bush, because Greenspan faced exactly the same threat, and yet he emerged triumphant.
Is there a ranking where he would be among Fed chiefs? And the second part of that question, could a Paul Volcker exist in this era where we don't seem to be able to accept short-term pain?
I think Paul Volcker is a great role model on inflation. If we ever get back to a world where inflation is really high, he would be the textbook to look at. I think in an era when the main threat is political attacks on the Fed, then the role model to study is Alan Greenspan. And I think his reputation, although it was rightly tarnished by the 2008 crash, because he was so powerful that he had to be responsible in some way for that, nonetheless, one should also remember his positive achievement, which was to create Fed independence, to stick up for it politically, and to prove himself so adept at fighting back against political attacks that the politicians were eventually too scared to touch him.
What do you think of the Fed mission, the dual mandate, inflation and employment? Should they just focus on one, on the inflation side?
The real world is complicated and messy, and if you try to reduce the central bank's mission to only one thing, like inflation, you're missing a lot of what matters. And in particular, I think you should look at asset prices. I think that we've learned from the NASDAQ crash, we've learned from 2008, that it's not just price stability that matters, financial stability matters, and I think the central bank has to recognize that.
That's a great point, and obviously that's a weakness, you have to say, on the Greenspan side, although he detected it. And let me ask, on that, with his data-driven approach, he's the guy that came up with this, the reason everything was booming in the Clinton years was productivity. Was that really based on real data in the end?
I think it was. I mean, in 1996, when Greenspan made that determination, he was right about productivity, and furthermore, it's not like the market then crashed in 1997, 1 year later, proving that, the apparent prosperity was just a bubble. No, the market crashed in 2000. So there were 4 years between Greenspan's determination about productivity and the problems in the stock market. So I think you've got to say he was completely right about productivity, and that was one of his sort of genius statistical calls. He was not right, however, in 1999, when he allowed those interest rate cuts after long-term capital management to remain in the system, and that enabled more bubbly behavior than there should have been.
Where do you think he is now on the Dodd-Frank? You've got the systemically important financial institutions, the Volcker rule, too big to fail, too big to jail, actually, too. Is he in favor of these kinds of regulatory changes? Where would you think he would stand?
No, Greenspan is a critic of Dodd-Frank and thinks most of it should be scrapped. What he believes in is banks should have more capital, so that once they've got more capital, then they're safe to go out and take a lot of risk as they see fit, and the taxpayers won't have to bail them out. So that's his view on how you fix finance.
Actually, a simpler approach. What about the Trump incoming Trump thing? Is the uncertainty a big threat? Is inflation a threat? Is it a bond market crash? How would he assess the Trump thing?
The American people voted for somebody who was going to shake up the system, and that's why they like him. Now, shaking up systems means volatility in markets, right? There's going to be huge, shifts in one direction and the other direction. Right now, business leaders in Wall Street seem to be optimistic about what Trump means for them, and so we've seen stock prices going up. But I think it's equally possible that there'll be some radical shift in sentiment when he does something they don't like. And so he just is he's a huge, wild card in the game. And I think what we should basically expect is that, A, markets will be jumping around in a more crazy fashion than normal because he'll be jumping around in a more crazy fashion than most presidents. And secondly, if things go wrong, I think by temperament, Trump has shown that he's willing to attack the Fed and blame the Fed, scapegoat the Fed. And so that tradition of Fed independence, which we've enjoyed for 25 years, may be eroded.
What does he think of the fact that entitlements, unfunded liabilities, Fannie and Freddie, our debt situation, are not really being addressed?
I mean, I think he's very concerned about Fannie and Freddie. That is a battle that he waged as Fed chairman. Greenspan in 2004 testified quite forcefully about needing to rein in Fannie and Freddie, make them smaller, cap the size of their portfolios. And that, by the way, is an example of how he tried to get regulation to prevent the 2008 crisis. But regulation is incredibly difficult. And what happened in that case was that Fannie and Freddie ran TV commercials to make it clear to members of Congress that if they supported Greenspan reforms, then there would be negative TV commercials in their district come the next election.
All right, we're down to the last minute. Tell us the shape Greenspan's in now. What's he doing, and has he done an assessment of your book? Has he given it to you, what he thought?
Oh, yeah. I mean, he is 90 years old, but he's still bright, and he's still curious about the world. He read my book, and he said it's not always positive, but it is accurate. And I thought that was a very generous assessment.
This has been a great quick hour, and that Financial Times McKinsey Business Book of the Year, it's a great read. It's epic. The Man Who Knew the Life and Times of Alan Greenspan. We've been talking with Sebastian Mallaby. Our next show, we've got former NBC CEO. He was former GE Capital CEO. He was GE Vice Chair Bob Wright. He'll be back on our show. He's got a new foundation he's just established to go after pancreatic cancer, which his wife died of. There's been no improvement of survivability. It's lethal, and he's going to take it on. Thanks to Sebastian Mallaby from London. Thanks to our national audience for listening. See you next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell.